Hello, I'm Dorothy Lazard, the librarian at the Oakland Public Library's Oakland History Center. Today, I want to share with you a bit of history of African Americans in early Oakland. Though the popular impression is that the city's African American population arrived during World War II, that's a major misconception. African Americans have been here since Oakland's earliest days, some arriving even before the city's incorporation in 1854. They came pursuing the same dreams of personal, political, and economic freedoms that brought whites west. Some were newly emancipated, some were free Northerners. Once they settled, they found work as sailors, laborers, draymen, cooks, painters, domestics, dressmakers, teachers, barbers, waiters, and railroad workers. Together, they established the institutions that would build and sustain their community and place an indelible mark on the city. So let's begin. Here you're seeing a picture of Oakland as it appeared in 1869. Oakland was 17 years old then, having been established as a town in 1852. This is Broadway and around 7th Street. 1869 is a particularly important date in Oakland history because it was selected to be the terminus, the western terminus for the Transcontinental Railroad, bringing thousands of people here to the city and really growing the city, not only in population, but in enterprise, in businesses, in housing stock, and so forth. And here is that first Transcontinental Railroad depot, which was at 7th and Broadway. This would make 7th Street a very important street to African Americans in that the trains, the Transcontinental Railroad had also by 1869, by the time of its completion, had employed Pullman cars, and the Pullman Company, founded by George Pullman, who was a Chicago-based industrialist, he employed exclusively African Americans to serve as Pullman porters and maids. The importance of this is that he knew that coming out shortly after the slavery era, that people would be used to African Americans serving them. And so he created this kind of serving class of people. But the Pullman porters are an interesting population of the African American population. They're an interesting segment in that they were both servants and leaders. Here are a few Pullman porters around 1890 here in Oakland. Now, the Pullman Company in Oakland required that all Pullman employees live west of Adeline Street. And that created this enclave of African Americans, although West Oakland at the time in the late 19th century was very multicultural with Italians and Irish and Serbians and Jews. West Oakland was our earliest neighborhood. It was where the city was founded. West Oakland and what we know of as downtown in West Oakland was where the city began. And, but that employment requirement turned West Oakland into a predominantly African-American enclave. And as the city grew geographically, physically, and people identified as white could move to other areas of the city, West Oakland became more and more of an African-American district. Just another picture of a Pullman. The Pullmans were comparatively a well-paid segment of workers in that they weren't given a salary. They were not salaried employees. They relied on tips for their work, and they worked very long hours. At the beginning, they had no salary at all. And then as the century turned, they were given a salary, but a very low salary. But comparatively, they were better paid than your average agricultural or domestic worker or day laborer. So they took brought not only money to the West Oakland community, they also brought information. The Pullmans traveled all over the country. They were very savvy in that they were exposed to not only talk, but also newspapers, informing them of what was going on in the country politically, what was going on in other segments of the country as far as culture and opportunities for African Americans. And when you think about this whole network, national network of men and women who were being exposed to things that they certainly wouldn't be exposed of in educational settings of the time, they brought back to the Oakland community, some very important information about self-determination and advocacy and politics, and also a lot of economic information. The Porters became kind of a merchant class in that they could forward some of them to purchase houses and businesses in West Oakland. And so they kind of created a Black middle class for the city. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of education, since I mentioned the Porters. This is a picture of Jeremiah Sanderson, and the picture next to it is of his daughter, Mary, along with the pupils of the Brooklyn Colored School. Now, the Brooklyn Colored School was important to Oaklanders. Brooklyn at the time was a community across Lake Merritt from Oakland, a neighboring community. And Sanderson, who had been an abolitionist, who had worked with Frederick Douglass, he had come from New Bedford, Massachusetts. He had started and been a strong advocate for the education of Black children and the opening of schools. He had worked in Sacramento and Stockton, working as a principal and teachers before arriving in Oakland and starting his school in 1871. He welcomed Oakland students who didn't have a school of their own. At the time, he and his daughter opened up the Brooklyn Colored School to Oakland school children. And so they would go across the bridge at the time to get to the town of Brooklyn, the little town of Brooklyn, which is a community we now know of as East Lake and San Antonio. And so he educated the students. He was a very strong advocate on the statewide level too, in that he attended the colored conventions held in Sacramento, where they advocated for not only educational opportunities for African Americans, but also other civil rights, such as being able to testify against whites in court of law. Here's William Shorey. William Shorey was known as the Black Ahab. He was a very courageous and forward-thinking sailor and sea captain. And as I said, called the Black Ahab because of some of his exploits in the polar regions. He and his wife, Julia, who you see pictured here with their children, were big civic and philanthropic leaders in Oakland. Julia was a part of the group of women who created Julia was a part of the group of women and men who created the home for the aged and infirm colored people, which was an institution that was located in the town of Beulah, which is around the area or in the area where Mills College is now located. They certainly supported and helped sustain the African-American community through their philanthropic work, through their networking, their support of both churches and educational institutions. And so they were very important in Oakland's history. Oh, by the way, since we're in a pandemic year, I should say William Shorey died in the previous pandemic in 1919 of what they called then the Spanish influenza. Here is that home I mentioned that Julia Shorey and others helped to build in the town of Beulah, established in September 1892. And here also is a picture of Alvin Coffey. He was a gold miner who had come after some years to Oakland and posted and donated $500 for the completion of the building of this home, which would be extended over the years in size. And he was also what they called at the time the home's first inmate. And he lived out the rest of his life there. Here is Beth Eden Baptist Church. Beth Eden was not the first, but the second Oakland African-American congregation. The first being Shiloh, or the African-American Methodist Episcopal Church, which was organized in 1858. And then Beth Eden came, and this is what the Easter Sunday in 1902 looked like. I wanted to include a picture of Lydia Flood Jackson. She was a member of a very pioneering Black Oakland family. Her parents were Isaac and Elizabeth Scott Flood. Elizabeth founded the first school for Black students in Oakland, which was run out of their home. And once this couple married, they really advocated not only for educational opportunities, but they helped found the first Black church, the AME church, that was organized in 1858, as I said. And they were really in support of all kinds of philanthropic services to the African-American community. Lydia herself became a civil rights advocate following in her parents' footsteps. She was a businesswoman, and she is also credited as being the first African-American child born in Oakland. She died, as it says here, at the age of 101 in 1963. Oakland, because of its geographic advantage of being both a port city and a terminus for a transcontinental railroad, was always marketing itself, always luring people to its community and growing the community because of these advantages of being a shipping port and a rail station. So if you had a business, for example, and you want to get your goods to other places, to other countries, there wasn't a much more ideal place than Oakland. It was also a very strong industrial town at the turn of the last century. And it was growing steadily from its very modest, the African-American population too, from its very modest, in 1852, when the city was founded, its first census recorded only 6 native-born African Americans, 1 woman, 5 men, and 8 foreign-born Blacks. By the time this brochure came out in 1902, the population has risen to 235,000 people. African Americans constituted just a small amount of that population, but it was steadily growing, as we'll see. One of the things that helped it to grow was the 1909 annexation of the neighboring towns, which doubled the size of the city. As you can see here on this promotional map that ran in the papers, in 1909, Oakland and the leaders, the civic leaders of these various communities got together, put a ballot measure on the ballot, a ballot initiative on the ballot, and took a vote and decided it was more advantageous for those smaller communities to become a part of Oakland, economically advantageous to become a part of Oakland, as opposed to becoming their own independent town. The advantage clearly was Oakland had the opportunity for growth. It had the tax base. It had the geographic advantages of having the port, having access to shipping, and having already a strong industrial profile. Here's just a street scene that is still a major intersection today, the gore of a Telegraph and Broadway. In the lower left corner, you see Latham Fountain, which is now Latham Square. And you see streetcars. This is in 1910. And then you see to the right, the big building to the right is Kahn's department store. In the middle of the picture, kind of on the right side, is the McDonough Theater, which was a very prominent performance space, and the First National Bank, which is still there in the center of the picture. And here's the Southern Pacific Depot. By the time this building was built in 1912, the Central Pacific that had brought so many thousands of people to the East Bay had turned over its leases and its railroad right-of-ways to the Southern Pacific Company. And this is where the station out of which the West Oaklanders, the Pullman Porters, would certainly work out of this station. This was their primary location. And there was, again, as I said, the restriction of having to live nearby because they were on 24-hour call, the Porters were. And so they could be called at any time to take a trip, across country or down the coast. And so they had to be nearby. And here's a picture of the Black Masons, the fraternal orders and the civic orders and what they call the secret societies really supported the African-American community by providing scholarships and apprenticeships and sometimes room and board, and just trying to build and make opportunities for the African-American communities that weren't always equitably distributed in the larger society. It was they were independent and interdependent, these organizations were. Here again is another organization that really supported the community. This is the California Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, who in 1915 met in Oakland, had their conference in Oakland. And so here's that gathering. These women advocated for educational as well as political opportunities for women. They advocated for voting rights. They were locally connected to several other organizations that help the African American community. And these networks of women were really important to educating the community about what needed to happen to help the community grow and thrive. Again, another brochure about Oakland, where ship and rail meet was a common and very popular marketing slogan early in the 20th century. And it's bragging here about the terminus of 3 transcontinental railroads. By the time this brochure came out in the early 1920s, I believe, Oakland was the terminus for not only the Southern Pacific, but the Western Pacific and another railroad that I'm blanking on. So again, more people coming and building out the city. But building out the city didn't always mean that there was expansion for the African American community. African Americans at this time, as the city was growing and building out its housing stock, incorporating all of those newly annexed communities to its borders, within its borders, there were the racial covenants being written up, and certainly a lack of access to loans, banking loans to afford houses. And then you had the perpetual low wages being paid for unskilled labor or domestic labor and other things. And so it was really important at that time for African Americans to, as my grandmother would say, make a way out of no way. And one of the ways they did that was to rely on the news and people educating them about what was going on. The news was a real community builder. And the Oakland Sunshine, Oakland's Black newspaper in the early part of the 20th century, was this weekly that was run by John Wiles. He was the first Black civil servant in City Hall. And while he was a janitor in City Hall, he was also the publisher of a paper. So you see this kind of, in a lot of times, a dichotomy of how people earn their living in one community might be very much different from how they exercise their skills or employ their skills in their own community. That certainly is true of the African American community in Oakland. So you can be a publisher in one community and a janitor in the other. And for Mr. Wiles, we have Delilah Beasley. Delilah Beasley, I think, more than any other person, is owed a debt of gratitude as far as acknowledging the value of the African American community, not only in Oakland, but in California. This Cincinnati, Ohio-born woman came to Oakland in 1910. She had worked as a maid, she had worked as a massage therapist, she had worked as a hairdresser, and she had come to the Bay Area initially a few years before she permanently settled here to work with a former patient of hers, or a client of hers, I should say, who lived in Berkeley. While she was there, a few years before she arrived in Oakland permanently, she visited Oakland, saw its thriving African American community, met people who would become her colleagues in civic organizations. And then in 1910, she came to stay. She was not only a contributor to the Oakland Sunshine, the Black newspaper, but she also contributed articles to the Oakland Tribune, and she became its first Black columnist. She also became, she started contributing columns in 1915. And by 1923, she became a weekly regular, or weekly columnist for the Tribune. And in doing so, she really elevated the African-American community. Her column was called Activities Among Negroes. And she talked about everything under the sun regarding the African-American community. And her goal, her stated goal, was to elevate the African-American community, but also to dispel really vicious and denigrating stereotypes about the community. She wrote about graduations. She wrote about military service, people in military service. She celebrated advancements that the community had made. She advocated for legislation. As this image here shows, she was an advocate for the eventually successful passage of an anti-lynching bill in California. She traveled all up and down throughout California, recording the history of African Americans, going all the way back to pre-Columbian times, pre-Western intervention times, even acknowledging Native Americans and the mission system that had decimated their population. She was collecting these stories for many years, and ultimately she published The Negro Trailblazers of California. This self-published book remains in print more than 100 years after its publication. She's visited institutions like the Bancroft Library and the Huntington Library. She interviewed early African-American pioneers, people who had come out for the gold rush. She interviewed former enslaved peoples, and she really made it her mission. And this was her advocacy, and this was her political activism, was through the writing and through the acknowledgement of the achievements and the struggles of the African-American community. Fortunately now, she is being celebrated for her journalistic work, but also for her work as a historian, because before this, no one had ever written any book of any substance about the African-American population in California. And so you can see in the New York Times articles and books, people, and also blogs and things on the internet about her. She remains a mystery though, personally, because she never married, she never had children. This book, The Negro Trailblazers of California, is kind of her baby. And we are still celebrating that work. A few Oakland firemen. The fire department didn't integrate until the early 1950s. And here are 3 firemen. There was a fire department, which actually the building is still there on 8th and Alice. That was the segregated firehouse, engine house. And eventually that moved to West Oakland on Magnolia Street. And then early in the 1950s, the department was integrated. And so African Americans have always had to struggle as far as employment, to find representation, to find opportunities, and to find legitimization to be recognized for the labor that they provided the city. For example, a story I don't want to fail to mention is the Pullman Porters. Now, the Pullman Porters, for all of their social and economic importance to the African-American community, they struggled for 12 years to be recognized as a legitimate union of workers. And C.L. Dellums of Oakland was one of the co-founders and big promoters of the country's first African-American union. From 1925 to 1937, they struggled to be recognized by the major unions for better pay, for better working conditions, but they also, more substantially, I think, inspired other workers, or just as substantially, inspired other workers to fight for their employment rights, for safety, work safety, hours, and working conditions. So they cast a huge shadow of influence over the West Oakland community, and I think the national community, because their struggle was so protracted, so long, and fought so bravely, because there was a lot of pushback against labor unions, Blacks participating in labor unions. There was at the time a fear of communism and what it would mean to the country. But it did take an enormous amount of bravery. So I don't want to pass up their contributions in that regard. Here's a picture of a West Oakland cafe. And, you know, when you talk to people, I've had the opportunity to talk to people who lived in West Oakland and also East Oakland in the 1930s and 40s. And even if they lived in East Oakland or North Oakland, they always identified West Oakland as the hub of Black life. So there was a lot going on there. Again, another organization that really helped grow the African-American community was the Linden Street Y. Here again is another organization that was racially segregated, but nevertheless, they helped people find jobs. They provided job training programs. They provided housing referrals. They offered holiday dinners to seniors. They offered practical courses like dressmaking and tailoring. They offered children's sporting events and cultural events where they could perform. The Linden Street Y was on 8th and Linden Street. And in 1946, shortly after World War II, the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, finally integrated. And so finally, but the Y was, the West Oakland Y was a really, really important organization. Entrepreneurship, always really important in the African-American community, where jobs were scarce elsewhere, or promotion, mobility, economic or occupational mobility was limited elsewhere. You could find work with African-American entrepreneurs that not only ran things like, you know, the Wood Street Fish Market, but also, you know, funeral homes and real estate businesses and all manner of businesses. And this is C.L. Dellums later in life. And as I said, he was a co-founder of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He was a porter himself who had been, you know, fired from the Pullman Company for his labor activism, but he was unabashed in his support of the rights of African-American workers. He would also become the head of the local NAACP. He worked also for labor relations on a statewide level during the 40s and 50s, primarily. And he's just very important. He's also, incidentally, he was the uncle of our Oakland mayor, Ron V. Dellums, and he was Ronald V. Dellums was also a state House representative for the East Bay for over 25 years. And this C.L. Dellums was his uncle. So this last picture that I'll show is a picture of Black barbers and beauticians. And they had joined forces sometimes in, I think, 1946 is when this picture was taken. And they wanted to unionize. And so basically all of these events and players that I've briefly talked about today contributed to the activism, the growth, and the achievements of the war years and the years that followed. As this group of people did, they were inspired by what had come before. They had benefited from the work that had come before, the sacrifices that had come before. And so that emboldened them to continue that work, to continue that advocacy, to continue building and educating their community. But that's a story for another day. So thank you all for joining us. And thank you for supporting the Oakland Public Library. And I hope this history talk has enlightened you about Oakland's African-American history. Bye-bye. Have a good day.